Hi everyone, I wanted to make a verbal version of this ink pad comparison because I feel like I can go further in depth into certain details verbally than I could in type. This might be the only video you'll hear my voice in, but we'll see how things go. Today I will be comparing 4 types of ink pads. On the left side we have the VersaMagic chalk ink pads and the Brilliance ink pads by Tukineko, and on the right side we have the Junesix chalk ink pads and Junesix Stardust ink pads. I am not too sure why they come in 2 names. I believe the patent is still pending for these ink pads on the right, but they're basically from the same series. The VersaMagic ink pads and Junesix ink pads have the same color series available, and the Brilliance ink pads and Junesix Stardust ink pads have the same color series. I got the VersaMagic ink pads from a stationery store in my neighborhood and the Brilliance ink pads off someone who was selling them at half price, and I got the Junesix ink pads from a Chinese website called Taobao, or if you're not from my neck of the woods, you might know them as AliExpress. The Junesix ink pads are super cheap and I think they're kind of a knockoff product of the Tukineko ink pads, but you didn't hear it from me. I will be comparing how the images turn out after stamping, so basically the ink quality, and also whether the colors of the same name from each series are indeed the same shade. Just a disclaimer, this video is made purely for those who want to learn about the differences between the 2 brands before purchasing the ink pads. I am not endorsing any product over the other. I tried looking for reviews that compared the brands before I bought them, but I couldn't find any, so I thought I'd make a video for those who find themselves in my shoes. So Junesix Stardust ink pads are a cheaper version of the Brilliance ink pads, and the Junesix Luxury Chalk ink pads are cheaper versions of VersaMagic. You can see that the shape and mechanics of the ink pads are very similar. The covers of the VersaMagic and Brilliance ink pads are slightly tighter than those of Junesix ink pads, so that is a plus for the Tukineko ink pads because for one, the ink wouldn't dry up as easily in storage, and also you wouldn't accidentally stain your hands or anything else if you drop the ink pads or bump into them. All these ink pads here are stackable, but VersaMagic and Brilliance ink pads have a tighter grip on each other. The Junesix ink pads do not stack as tightly. You can see that the Junesix ink pads are so similar to the Tukineko ink pads that they even have that slight silver shimmer in the Stardust ink pads, just like the Brilliance ink pads. Alright, let's start comparing some ink pads. I will be comparing them on the same cardstock paper. This is the same cardstock that I usually use for card making. I don't have the exact same shades in both series for all of my colors, so I am just going to use similar shades. I will be starting with the VersaMagic chalk ink pad, and I am using the color Pretty Petunia. For Junesix, I am using the color Spring Pansy. The VersaMagic image appears crisper than the Junesix image, and it shows more of the finer details of the stamp image. Next, I will be using the color Aspen Mist. I was curious to know if there are shade differences between the brands, and since I do not have a teardrop ink pad for Aspen Mist, I only have the rectangular one. I got one from Junesix. Let's see if there are any color differences. There is a color difference between the brands. VersaMagic is a lot lighter than Junesix, but from the get-go I noticed that the Junesix sponge was darker, so it is no surprise that the image comes out darker than VersaMagic. And like before, VersaMagic's image is crisper than Junesix. Let's compare one last pair of ink pads before moving on to the Brilliance and Stardust ink pads. Here we have Pink Petunia for VersaMagic and Pink Grapefruit for Junesix. Once again, the VersaMagic image comes out crisper than Junesix. So, after getting the same results for the 3 comparisons, I think it is safe to say that VersaMagic would be the better choice if you want to stamp crisp images, but colors from both series are all very pretty. Okay, moving on, we have the Brilliance ink pads and Junesix Stardust ink pads. First, I used the Brilliance Pearlescent Lime ink pad and the Stardust Pearlescent Sky Blue ink pad. The Brilliance image did not come out too clearly, probably because I did not apply enough ink on it, but you can see that the image is crisper for Brilliance. Both images have a slight shimmer, which is what the series are known for. Next, I compared the Pearlescent Lavender shade from both brands. I got the Pearlescent Lavender shade from Junesix because I damaged the sponge for my Brilliance ink pad, so I just took that as an opportunity to see whether the colors are the same for both brands. There is already a difference in sticker and sponge color, so let's see if the ink colors are different as well. Once again, the Brilliance image is crisper and the Junesix color is darker than Brilliance. Both images carry their signature shimmer and just look totally gorgeous. I stamped the Brilliance image again, this time with more ink applied to the stamp, because I wanted a fairer comparison. The lines of the image still turned out thinner and crisper for Brilliance, and the shade difference is still apparent. There is not much difference in the finer details where the dotted line is though, because I used so much ink this time. Lastly, we have Starlite Black for Brilliance and Starlite Silver for Junesix. The Brilliance is still crisper and both images carry a shimmer. In my stamping journey, I noticed that the shimmery inks tend to smudge, so I tested for that as well for Brilliance and Junesix. Each pair have been given about the same amount of time to dry, so let's dive in. I gently rubbed against the 4 Brilliance images to see whether the glitter smudges across the card, because I have encountered that problem before when I accidentally touched them after their stamping, but before they dried. Not a lot of glitter came off onto my finger here for the Brilliance images. Now I am testing out the Junesix images with individual fingers. The Junesix Pearlescent Sky Blue image smudged a little on the card. A lot more glitter came off the card onto my fingers, so Junesix is not as smudge proof as Brilliance. Let's test the Brilliance images again with individual fingers. The Pearlescent Lavender image smudges a little more easily than the other colors, but not a lot of glitter rubbed off onto my finger relatively. The Junesix images are slightly smudged, but still retain their shimmer. I tested the inks off camera with water, and these inks are all waterproof. In my experience, the colors also do not fade over time too easily if the cards are kept properly. What's my verdict? The Junesix ink pads are decent substitutes for the VersaMagic and Brilliance ink pads if you don't mind your image to be less crisp, especially if you're just starting off your stamping journey and are on a budget, since the Junesix ink pads are a lot cheaper. But for more professional stamping, I would go with the VersaMagic and Brilliance inks. I personally bought the Junesix ink pads to practice blending techniques, and I do not mind some of my images coming out not super crisp for the more casual projects, so I would definitely get more of these ink pads. The Junesix sponges feel squishier and wetter than the Tsukiniku ink pads, indicating that the inks might be thinner, so that might explain why the images are not as crisp. But if you're like me, you're relatively new to stamping and want to practice with non-expensive inks, they are a great investment because they are definitely better than the typical cheap stamping inks you'd find that go for $1 or under $1, and the colors are all super pretty. So that is my short comparison of these ink pads, and I hope that you found this helpful. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you like my video or just comment below, because I love hearing from people from the crafting community. Feel free to also hit the subscribe button if you'd like to check out my future videos. I have some craft tutorials planned, so that would be one way to make sure you don't miss them. I wish you a wonderful day or night whenever it is you're watching, and stay safe, stay healthy.